Hello, everyone. Please forgive my off-centeredness. My camera is a little bit wonky, but I am here, and Rudi Dornemann is here, and Robert Levy is here, and this is Nighttime Logic. Hello, Rudi and Robert. How are you today?
Hi.
Doing
Decent.
good. Hot, but good.
Yeah, that's the name of the game. For viewers here in the U.S., it's no secret that uh, it's quite. We don't even have to. I don't even have to come up with a clever name. It is a hellishly hot summer. So hoping this finds everybody cool and doing well. It is July 21st, 2022, and we're going to get into some genre fiction for you all tonight. I'm going to be calling up our readers' biographies. I'm going to read that to you right now. So we've got a lot of great conversation, a lot of great fiction tonight. So I'm going to get started by introducing you to Rudi and Robert. Robert Levy's novel, The Glittering World, from Gallery and Simon & Schuster, was a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award, as well as the Shirley Jackson Award, while his shorter work has appeared in the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, Nightmare, Black Static, and The Dark, as well as numerous year's best anthologies, including the Best Horror of the Year and the year's best gay speculative fiction. His novella, Anaïs Nin at the Grand Guignol, written in the style of the literary icon's Legendary Diaries, was published in 2019 by Levy Press. Trained as a forensic psychologist, he teaches at the Stone Coast MFA program in creative writing and can be found at therobertlevy.com. Please welcome Robert Levy. Hey, Robert.
Hey, Daniel. How you doing?
Doing great. Doing great. Going to introduce Rudi. Rudi Dornemann grew up in Milwaukee and now lives in Maine. His writing has appeared in places like Strange Horizons, Realms of Fantasy, and the Mummy anthology Spirits Unwrapped. He instigated and contributed to the flash fiction website, The Daily Cabal, and recently had a new flash piece appear in the online magazine Pareidolia Literary. He sends out monthly speculative fiction stories via a podcast and email series, Notes from an Imaginary Place, which can be found and subscribed to at his website, which is rudidornemann.com. And just a line to add to Rudi's biography, which is one of the reasons we're here tonight. Rudi also has a story in the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, which is the most current issue. He shares a table of contents with Robert. So welcome, Rudi. How are you?
Good. And I have to mention that it's my wife's birthday today, and she was
Happy
kind enough
birthday,
to
Audrey.
Happy
appear.
birthday.
Hello.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday to Audrey. Well, a lot of great things to be happy about. Before we jump into the fiction, I think the two of you know just how excited I am to be here with the two of you. I'm a longtime reader of the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. So many of my favorite authors, so many of my favorite stories have been in there, which now includes the two of you. So well done. Congratulations. And thank you so much. Oh, you've got one.
I
I've been looking for
I
it all
got my
night.
author copies in the mail about 6 hours ago.
Wow.
Oh,
There it
perfect
is.
timing.
With the
This is
cover
the
story illustration of Rudi's story.
Yeah,
Oh,
I am
it's
still blown
gorgeous.
away.
Your names are lights. Congratulations on this achievement. Congratulations on two fantastic stories, which we're gonna hear from them tonight and talk about them a bit. So let's without further ado, let's jump into the fiction. Um, let's hear from Robert's story. Robert, I'll turn the screen over to you, and if you want to set up your story, and uh, we'll hear a bit from your story from the magazine of fantasy and science fiction.
Cool. Well, thanks so much, Daniel. I'm very excited to be here with you and with Rudi as well. I'm going to be reading the basically a little more than half of the story I have in the new issue of FNSF. It's called Ceremonials, and I don't think I have to set it up too much since we're starting at the beginning. So I'll probably be reading for about 20 to maybe 25 minutes at the outside. But here we go. Ceremonials. You might be inclined to think that the tree made us do what we did, though in truth it was only an invitation. It wanted us to feed it, yes, to be its pollinating emissaries, but that doesn't mean it caused our righteousness or our rage. All the tree did was make us see ourselves for what we really were. We were only 15 after all, and already so familiar with the range of indignities that could befall us at any time. Already we longed for power and for justice, to blossom into our birthright and become something else altogether. 8 weeks away from home was our opportunity to reinvent ourselves. You can be whatever you want at summer camp, our mothers told us. We tell our own children that today. And so perhaps our wish to change primed us for the transformation. We were open, and so we were open further until we were turned inside out. Of the 5 of us, we were 6 once before Steph's mono came roaring back and our parents had to drive up from Boston to take her home. It was Melissa who first spotted it. Heat close to unbearable by noon, we were on our way back from the waterfront. Lake water already dried from our 1 pieces and 2 pieces and the skin of our browned limbs. We separated from the main path leading back to the cabins and forged our own desire line through the woods, the overarching boughs of the pines and firs keeping us safe from the midday sun. After 15 minutes, however, it was obvious we had lost our way. Sari and Amy argued about which direction to go, Lauren eyeing the beds of her fingernails while Beth did a wobbly-footed plie, releve, plie, until we collectively grew aware of Melissa frozen at the lip of our small circle. She faced away from us, still as a statue, with her hands pressed to her stomach, as if she were holding something inside. Mel, Amy said, "Hello, what is with you?" She just stared blankly into the trees, and we looked to each other for answers. Melissa? Lauren took a cautious step toward her. You okay? You see that? Melissa whispered, bending branches from her path as she began to trundle her way through the underbrush. 50 yards into the woods, and we followed her until we finally caught up, our paths braiding together as we arrived at the source of her intense focus. It resembled a rock formation of some kind, a lone stalagmite. Maybe 2 feet around and a dozen feet tall, it rose from a rutted brown mound, ridged and lichen-dappled and studded with a honeycomb of toothy white seeds. Its trunk or stem or spine reached in a monolithic column to bisect the shaded canopy of leaves in a gray and twisted and almost silvered spike. At its midsection was a stratum of wilted appendages, protuberances hanging limp with puckered mouths dangling toward the forest floor, where the small bones of unidentifiable woodland creatures littered the ground. What is it? Melissa asked. I don't know, Lauren said. Some kind of messed up tree? Petrified, maybe. Fossilized. Sari ran her hand along its rough hide, her fingernails tapping against it. These weird long carbuncle things, they're hollowed out. By insects, maybe? That would be my guess. It doesn't look like it belongs here, Lauren said, and shielded her eyes to scan the surroundings. It's the only one like it around. I think it's cool. Beth bent down to inspect its scaly sheen, the individual facets so glossy they caught stray glimmers of sunlight on their gunmetal bark, the surfaces almost reflective. Freaky looking, isn't it? I don't know. I like it. It looks like a giant dick. Amy leaned over and sniffed at it. But it smells like a big old vag. Does it? Mel took a whiff. Liar, it doesn't smell like anything. Made you try, though, Amy said, and Beth gave her a little shove. Lauren stared up at the crown, the point of its curved tip barely discernible against the wide sweep of leaves and branches and understory, all backlit by the bright white sky. Reminds me of a maypole. You guys do May Day at school? There was a maypole at a day camp I went to, Sari said. We used to sing the song as we danced around it, while we weaved all the ribbon strings together. Arise, arise, you fair pretty maid, and bring your May bush in. That is literally the gayest thing I've ever heard. Amy grabbed the trunk in 2 hands and started grinding on it. If it was thinner, it'd make a dope stripper pole, though. Too bad no one would pay to see your skanky ass, Mel said, and Amy flipped her the bird. It wants, Beth whispered from where she crouched. And someone said. I don't remember who. She didn't respond. No one said anything until the quiet was interrupted by this distinct crunching of leaves underfoot. Shh, Lauren hissed. We slumped down and duck walked along the forest floor until we were concealed in a nettled bush edging the clearing. A shout, followed by hoots of laughter, and the muffled voices of boys resounded across the woods. Yo, man, it's gonna be sick, one of them said. It was Bunk 10, our brother Bunk, who'd been hassling us all summer. We bristled as one, memories of snapped bra straps and taunts and undisguised leers goose-fleshing our already prickled skins. We gotta wait for the counselor retreat, another said. Surely Tommy Gardner. That's soon, right? Tonight, my dad rented out the Lobster Shack. This from Jared Slater, whose father was the director of the camp, which made him as close to untouchable as they came. He had a raging hard-on for Lauren and was always trying to dance with her at socials, draw her to the back of the meeting house during movie nights, get her alone. We all turned to her, Lauren's eyes frantic with hyper-alertness, the way a rabbit looks just before it bolts. Nasty shit, a fourth one said, this being Eric Kirsch. Nasty shit. And their unmodulated voices soon faded, along with their lumbering footfalls. We remained silent and still long after their departure. How cavalier they were, how heedless and free and unburdened, the ease of young men. We had moved through these same woods with a similar ease, of course, only just before. All that had brought it to an end was them. Assholes. Mel slapped the pine needles from her haunches as she rose. Sounds like they're planning their next circle jerk. Gross, Amy said. Don't make me think about their tiny baby cocks. I'll lose my tater tots. Yeah, sure, like you're so picky. I know, right? I'll take what I can get. Mel and Amy carried on, to Sari's begrudging amusement. Lauren stood and considered the strange tree again before she turned back to Beth, who stayed sitting by the edge of the clearing. Hey, she said. They're gone. You sure? Beth laughed, but there was nothing behind it. Yeah, I'm sure. Lauren smiled and reached out her hand, and Beth took it, used it to help herself up. We touched our restless hands to the smooth trunk as we made our way around it and back the way we came. Heat overripe by midnight, well past curfew, but our counselors were away on the retreat, so we were wide awake, huddled together in the bathroom and talking while we did our hair or our nails or our lips. All except for Beth, who sat with us for the sake of appearances, but was immersed in a moldering Archie digest she'd unearthed from the crawl space beneath the cabin. We sang pop songs at the top of our lungs, Lauren rolling her tube of cherry red lipstick up and down in time, the smell of sweat and sunblock perfuming the air as everything pulsed in the same hungry rhythm, the same vast organism heaving with expectant breath. We knew something was going to happen. We just didn't know what. You guys, keep it down, Sari whisper-seethed, her own lipstick smeared in a pin-thin line at the corner of her mouth. I am not doing KP again for you loud bitches. My hair smells like bug juice. Hey, Beth. Lauren reached down and wagged the lipstick in front of her. Want to try? It suits your skin tone. Beth lowered her digest, her wide, round eyes blinking her way out of Riverdale and back into Camp Arcadia's second most senior girls' cabin. What? Oh, no, thanks. It's almost bedtime. What's the point? What's the point of anything? Melissa took the tube from Lauren, squatted down in front of Beth, and proceeded to paint her lips. We could all be dead tomorrow. Melissa made her blot and lifted Beth beneath her armpits until we all faced our reflections in the mirror. Well, Lauren said, what do you think? I think... Beth looked at herself this way and that, her lips curling up into a devious smile, until the lights cut off and the cabin was plunged into darkness. The fuck? Lauren managed to get out, before the sound of heavy footsteps on the porch silenced her, silenced all of us. Beth clenched Melissa's hand so hard it bled, so hard Mel would take the 3 crescent-shaped scars with her to the trial. Amy, ever brave, peeped her head out the rough-hewn door into the main room, only to be yanked forward with a yelp. That's when Sari screamed, echoed by more cries from everywhere at once. The fearful screams of girls, yes, but also the unfettered howls of boys, wild and feral. Penny raid! Eric Kirsch, flashlight swinging at his waist, ran up and down the bed rows, flipping mattresses, his face blackened by grease paint. Jared Slater, his face darkened as well, pinned Amy against the wall and licked her cheek with a fat tongue as Brent Coates rifled through Melissa's footlocker, T-shirts and shorts and bras tossed to the floor. They swarmed the cabin to fill all the empty private spaces everywhere and all at once. Get out of here, Lauren screamed. Get out! She beat against Eric's chest, his face, and finally his back. He laughed, bending to retrieve his fallen flashlight, and she placed her bare foot on the seat of his shorts and toppled him over, his head slamming against the floor. Fucking bitch, he snarled. Ow, fuck! Get out, she kept screaming. Get out! The boys guffawed as they careened toward the door, as we hurled epithets and bars of soap and tampons and magazines, until finally they were gone. Sari retrieved the flashlight from the floor and made her way to the main light switch, the cabin illuminated once more. Shaken and furious, we surveyed the damage, Sari already putting her sandals on to go wake up the camp director, the nurse, anyone who was still left on camp grounds. But we all stopped when we heard the low moaning coming from the bathroom. We approached as one and gathered in the doorway where we froze. Beth lay sobbing on the floor of the shower stall. Beneath her oversized t-shirt, she was attempting to hitch up her underwear, but they were twisted and tangled below her knees. Jesus, Mel went to her. But don't, Beth cried, please. And she waved her off. She pulled her underwear up, then wiped her eyes with the heels of her hands and bent to retrieve her now crumpled comic. He tried to take them. I'm fine, okay? Just give me a minute. Mel backed out of the bathroom, and Beth swung the door shut, latching the tarnished handle. We've got to do something, Amy said once we regrouped on the other side of the cabin, Sari dragging a cot against the door in case the boys returned. It had been 10 minutes, and Beth still hadn't come out of the bathroom. The unspoken problem was that Jared was the director's son, so how much punishment could they really face? There had to be another way. We can't let those little shits get away with this, Mel said, Sari nodding along beside her. We've got to fuck them up or they'll just come back for more. You guys, Lauren said, her face illuminated by the naked white light from the bathroom door she'd just towed open. Look. We crowded inside and stared at the window, its screen pushed through onto an unobstructed square of black night beyond. Beth was gone. We fanned out through the woods, took turns calling her name into the darkness, the gloom unbothered by the feeble beams from our flashlights. Stumbled over rocks and brambles, wove our way through the trees until it felt as if we were fleeing from something rather than seeking it out. All the while, We were alerted to the skitterings of small creatures and the stridulations of insects, each individual being reaching out to others of its kind. A wetness hung in the air, a pregnant stillness heavy with heat and the faint odor of night blossoms that scented the forest with traces of sweet sap and musk. But not just any night blossom, no. Even as the aroma enveloped us, as the faint green glow led us between the trees, we knew exactly where it was we were going, where we were meant to be all along. The alluring scent and erratic incandescence were accompanied by a soughing noise, a distant whistling like wind through pipes of slender wood, and soon we reached the gleaming provenance of such otherworldly sensation. Beth was there, drawn as we had been drawn. Seated at the center of the clearing, where nothing seemed to grow, it was plain to see now, how had we missed the surrounding barrenness before? Save the succulents she now held fast. Nothing around her in the tree but a wide and cautious circle of scattered brown needles, the bed of pine dead where it fell. Beth, Amy ventured, but like the rest of us, Amy was focused solely on the plant and the way Beth was stroking it from her prone and demure and worshipful position. The tree had changed since the afternoon. Now the heady growth was in full splendor, slicked with a silver-yellow viscosity that glowed in iridescent waves. It was crowned with a flowering blue spadix, the mossy green spathe spilled open around it in a dramatic sweep of leaves luxuriant with yellow fur, the drape of tongue-like fronds shuddering in an approximation of pleasure, whether due to Beth's stimulation or through some other means it was impossible to tell, and curled in a way that made the tree appear to return her rapt attention. The smell was stronger here, so much stronger, and the whistling took on greater clarity, a little lilting tune that wordlessly chanted of holy and faraway places, of bounty and lushness and escape, a song of ecstasy. Sari stepped into the clearing, and a moment later, Melissa did as well. All of us followed to join Beth, to be part of this sanctified moment, this most divine form of communion. We were intoxicated. Beth stripped the shirt from her skin, Lauren unclasping her own bra and letting it fall from her shoulders as Amy reached the tree and placed her hands on the supple stem. We stepped out of our sandals, our shorts, our underwear. Any part of us that had been hidden was now exposed to the moonlight, the providing air. Naked, we caressed the velvet soft leaves, the damp stamen, the trembling meat of it. We lost ourselves inside its music, its scent, the wet folds of its nature. How long we delighted there was anyone's guess. The time, it hardly mattered, however, for what was time anymore? Once we measured in befores and afters, in moments that might occur and change us forever. Our first period, surely, but also the loss of our dull, aching virginities, not gifts to give away so much as hand-me-downs to shed, a years-long game of hot potato we would never have to play again. Only two of us had yet crossed that threshold, the rest left on the same familiar side. Now, these milestones were rendered meaningless. The carnival ride of adolescence, that wild swung us in wide circles, had gone off its track altogether, each recognizable signpost distorted until we couldn't tell one from the rest. In this moment, time had stopped and no longer held any sway whatsoever. We had gained something enduring, which was each other. Finally, and at last, we were part of a greater whole. Flowers of midnight, flowers of the moon. We were born of the night blossom, the evening bloom. The plant issued forth its aqueous tang, redolent with lust. Adrenaline jacked through our veins and straight into our cerebral cortexes. We had become one with the tree. Do you hear it? Beth said. And of course we did. How could we not? Its language was unmistakable, written upon our very skin. Yes, Lauren said and nodded. It's hungry. So hungry. Sari's eyes filled with tears. We need to feed it. Now. Now, Amy said. Now, repeated Melissa. Now, we whispered. Now, 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 now. Until the word folded away from itself, coiled inward, and finally burst apart. Still naked, we beached our canoes at the boys' waterfront, bare feet plashing the shallows as we padded up the cold shore. Our arms were heavy with scavenged weapons of wood and steel. The sand bleached a blue-silver sheet in the glow from the low-zinc moon. Creepy crawled over the humpback dunes and into the trees. Red raw shoulders narrowed between the hides of birches and spruces and pines, the night forest alive with the low humming bass of piping insects and punctuated by the occasional chirrup and whir of a predatory bird as it broached the canopy overhead. A shifting breeze, and it was no longer just the algal smell of the lake that reached our nostrils, but that of sweet sap and lavender, of mildew and sex, all the manifold contents of the inflorescent tree and the ripe bouquet spurting from its perfumed heart. We breathed it in, slow and steady, in and out and in until our lungs were coated and filled near rupture with the fecund and unrelenting scent. The blood rushed to the surface of our skins, our faces and fingers and limbs tingling as if coming to newfound life, and we advanced through the darkness as our own team of hunters. We smelled them long before we reached the cabin. First, their various glamours and ointments, the chemical kick of roll-on deodorant and mouthwash and athlete's foot spray, all the many scented charms they used to subdue the ministrations of their baser natures. We ourselves belonged only to nature now, and so we lifted the veil upon these minor deceptions, drawn forward instead by the unmaskable odors of unwashed hair and ball sweat and the inebriating funks of boys becoming men, both repulsive and alluring in equal measure. We loved it, and we had to have it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert. That excellent reading. For those of you just joining us, this is Nighttime Logic. I'm your host. I'm Daniel Braum. I'm here with Rudi Dornemann and with Robert Levy, who just read an excerpt from Ceremonials, which appears in the latest issue of the magazine, Fantasy and Science Fiction, which Robert is holding up. You have a copy of it. It's the July/August 2022 issue, and it should be on its way to bookstores near you if it's not there already, and available electronically in the usual places you like to get your books at. Thank you for that great reading, Robert. Let's talk about transformation and reinvention, which is a thread that continues on through the story when people will read and get to finish the story. Why is it such a powerful element in fiction? And we heard the part that's taking place, most of it takes place in summer camp. So maybe we could focus on why is summer camp such a strong choice to portray the happenings of this particular story?
Well, I mean, it definitely for me goes back to, the line at the beginning where, you can be whoever you want at summer camp, as your parents tell you. It's a rare opportunity for someone to, step out of their regular life, or a kid to step out of their regular life and try something different without anyone else around who knows them from the school year or from away from their family, and certainly adolescence in general is a time where people are trying to figure out who they are, And I think, it's kind of like its own, having attended summer camp as a child for many, many years, the environment is its own kind of hermetically sealed bubble, where, the outside doesn't get in. And, it's so in that sense, it is an opportunity for transformation. I think ultimately in this story, as so many transformations can be, this becomes a frustrated attempt at at transformation, but a transformation nonetheless. So I think the combination of it being a kind of isolated environment, and coupled with the time of being a young adult, where you're figuring out who you are, your hormones are raging, and your emotions everything is greatly heightened. I think that makes an interesting stew to work with as a writer.
Yeah, you did a great job. You really did a great job of portraying that. Like you, I went through the experience and immediately knew what you were talking about. When you mentioned that the certain lines that go to that, and I've read the story a couple of times now, and now hearing you read it, there's so many layers and so many excellent things going on in the story that like it wasn't even in the forefront. Something that is always very important to me, which is setting, and just hearing you read it, like you also very adeptly, captured both the thematic aspect of the setting, but and also just the geographicness of just everything is placed in the different bunks, and the language of the girls referring to the brother bunk and the waterfront. Just hearing that really came forward. You're an excellent reader. Just came forward as I was listening to it, and not one of the times reading it. Back to the time of life, so to speak. We did get to meet, unfortunately, one of the antagonists of the story, Jared, the camp director's son. I think the line was, he's as close to untouchable as you can get as far as consequences for his actions, which we saw. We heard that passage of the harassment that went way too far. So one of the things that immediately struck me when I first read the story was just the parallels between these useful things, which are not innocent, at least not to me, but the parallel between these youthful transgressions and the crimes and abuse that we can't escape in the news right now and in this time. The kinds of people Jareds grow up to be and grow up to commit. So was this on your mind at all when you were drafting the story? And how does the horror genre lend itself to containing these sorts of human issues above and beyond just telling us a scary story, right? You could have just told us a scary story about a summer camp. Horror genre is packed with them.
It's a really interesting question, because I didn't, I'm trying to think of a time I set out to write an overtly political story. I don't think I've ever done that, but I think that when you observe human nature closely, which all writers hopefully do, that's going to bring up real world issues, because you're looking at real world people, and this is, as we all know, little Jareds grow up into big Jareds, and there's definitely, I'm also a parent of two children, one of whom is 14, and I'm there's and grew up at a time also where boys will be boys was absolutely like the norm, and that's hopefully changing to a certain extent, where really you could so much hideousness was excused. It's you know, I mean, I'm kind of a dyed-in-the-wool feminist, so it's not really a surprise that this this kind of story would result from me. But it's you know, it's, as we all know, uh, given recent events, and you can go back, you know, a month or a year or 5 years to find your whatever applicable recent events um, uh, are appropriate. But you know, there's definitely a sense that even though, you know, the more things change, the more they stay the same. So it's which is kind of maddening for many of us who have um, been the victim of Jared's in our lives. But you know, it's it's uh, it's definitely a yeah. I mean, ultimately, there's a lot of, I think a lot of um, political content to this story, even though I never set out to write it that way necessarily. But I think that just comes from life.
I'm glad you said that. Yeah, we'll get back to the fact that sadly, probably all of us know a Jared in one way or another. It made me think of some thoughts I had. Right, some of the first times I really had a chance to think about or talk about politics or even talk about stories for the first time, and it was the summer 20 years ago when Rudi was with me and in a workshop that we attended together. And yeah, it was the first time I started thinking about these sort of things or had teachers or other writers saying. So I think it's a great point about how you said you didn't necessarily set out to tell a political story. And look, there are always exceptions to any rule or any point, but at least I think I think a story has to entertain us first, at least in my opinion, before it does anything else. I think I love stories that have layers like this one. I love stories that can challenge us or maybe even change us. But yeah, it has to entertain us, and it has to have a story going on first. And yeah, in addition to the political layers that one can take away from in the story, yeah, there's an entertaining, albeit dark, story happening in ceremonials. Which brings us back to Jared's, one of those things that you just captured, which I think, which just doing several things. It's just giving the verisimilitude. It's the moment where the girls they're out there in the woods, and you're just showing how they're behaving, and then the instant the boys appear on the scene, they haven't done anything threatening yet. They've just appeared. They're just there, and you did a really perceptive, really steadily handled way of just showing how everything changes just and becomes a threat, or they have to become on guard just by the fact of they're there. I was going to just ask you about those real world dynamics, but you've told me exactly. You answered my question before I really asked it. But I want to go back to the very first lines of the story, which I'll read here. You might be inclined to think that the tree made us do what we did, though in truth it was only an invitation. It wanted us to feed it, yes, to be its pollinating emissaries, but that doesn't mean it caused our righteousness, our rage. All the tree did was make us see ourselves for what we really were. What a great opening. What a great opening. Those lines are doing so much. It's acting in one way as foreshadow. It's acting in one way as an explanation, and it has a symmetry with the ending, which most of us haven't gotten to yet. But I want to ask you. So it is a character looking back right from the start. I guess we're talking about it structurally. How does the choice of giving us that voice and giving us a narrator who knows looking back, how does it add a layer of tension or not? And how does it play with some of the expectations?
That's a really good question. It reminds me very much of something I talk to my writing students about, which is I like for them to know from a chronological perspective when they're telling a story from. Now, when you have a story in present tense, you're telling it from the here and now, right? But when you have a story in the past tense, I like them to ask themselves, almost as a kind of exercise, where, especially if it's first person, or in this case, it's flashes between first person and a second plural. There's no defined narrator in this. Ask yourself, is this a story that someone's telling you about something that happened to them today, like earlier in the day, or is this something that someone's telling you about something that happened to them 20 years from now? Because in real life, when someone's telling you a story, those are going to be two entirely different experiences. It's something, presumably certainly when you're writing a short story, it's almost always something that happened that's really, really big. And are you telling it from a raw place about in a perspective that is, a more recent perspective, or are you telling it from a farther away place where you can have more of a coolly distant view on what takes place? Now, that doesn't mean that you necessarily have to put that in the text, but I think it's important for writers at least to think about. And the example I always use with my students is To Kill a Mockingbird, which everyone thinks is a story that's narrated by a 6-year-old, but it's not. It's actually a story about a woman looking back at her childhood. And in fact, probably to this day, certainly the last time I looked, when you go to the Wikipedia page for To Kill a Mockingbird, it says it's about a 6-year-old narrator. That's not true. It's about a grown woman looking back at her childhood. There's not so much of that kind of frame device, but that's where the perspective comes from. And it's a totally different story than than it literally being from a 6-year-old's perspective. And you can move your perspective very, very close in the telling to it, but it's different. Looking back on something is always different, and you're able to contextualize events much more when you do that. I think, this was one, I don't do this often, but this was one way where I kind of wanted to literalize that experience. And also it enabled me to do the ending, which is in pretty much in I can't remember if it's the ending is actually in present tense or not, but it's like she's moved right up to now, the present, which is 30 years after these events. So
the voice catches up. The voice catches up in chronological age to we now meet the person who's actually telling us the story for a very brief instance, not to spoil it for our listeners, but it does bring me to my next question, which is, I'm a writer. I'm fascinated to hear. Oh, what's that, Rudy?
I was just going to comment also on the opening, if I could.
Please.
And yeah, I mean, the very first time I read it, it was like, tree, what's up with the tree? But then I realized that, what the narrator is really focused on is questions about responsibility, and that it's not because of the tree so much. But then as I was reading it, I mean, mostly I was kind of swept along and not thinking back to that too much. But to the extent that I did, I was thinking they were also being swept along, through the part that you've read in terms of what the tree's done, what the boys have done that they're reacting to. So to some extent, I was kind of going through with a little bit of a tension between me and that setup of responsibility. Like, I was like, well, I don't see that you're responsible yet. And also, not to spoil the ending, but I like the way that made me think more about it and like begin to kind of come around to where it all started.
I'm so glad. I'm so glad you chimed in. You said that, Rudy, because you said it so much more eloquently than I was about to. You really summed up the next thought that I want to, by just choosing that word responsibility. The way I phrased it and was going to phrase it to Robert was his choice in structure starts to move into a territory that always excites me, which is controlled ambiguities in fiction and in structure. And that opening line sets it up wonderfully, because like it is that line makes the question of responsibility, at least to this reader, an open question. And I was wondering, from reading it, I'll be able to talk to the author here right now, but from reading just the text, like as the solitary act I'm reading, so are these, we're being told straight out that, okay, some bad shit happened, and I was not controlled. Like it's someone taking responsibility in one way. Like it wasn't the tree. Like you might think, like you're going to hear this crazy story about a tree, which may or may not be true. That tree may or may not have controlled you. That tree may or may not be a carnivorous tree, right? But I'm here to tell you that there's something going on, but there was choice involved, and it was our choice. To further maybe I'm folding in too much on that. If we are dealing with the question that there's something biological or chemical happening with this tree, or even supernatural or magical, is she even telling us the truth? And those answers, for my enjoyment of the story, for my interpretation of the story, don't even necessarily matter. I thought, like as Rudi really adeptly said, that tension, at least for this reader, and for Rudi, was present there. So a less heavy question there. Is it scarier, or is it one kind of story or another, if the girls are controlled into doing what they do as revenge? Or is it scarier or a different kind of story if they're doing it of free will? Just both to Rudi and to Robert on that one.
Well, I mean, I don't know if it's scarier one way or the other necessarily, but I think this is also a story in some ways about consent. I mean, there's no consent between the boy cabin and the girl cabin, clearly, but is there consent between the girls and the tree? And do you that you have the narrator, who's very much a stand-in for all the girls, because in some sense the narrator is all the girls. They're kind of part of this, collective in some sense, having become one with the tree, as is put. Do you believe her? Do you believe that she believes what she's saying? And if so, do you believe her? It's I like trafficking in morally complicated concepts. I believe that fiction is richer when it's more, when there's a moral knot at the center of it. And I think that that's one of the moral knots I tried to plant in this story was, obviously they were seduced by the tree, but just because you're seduced doesn't mean that you're not willing. But are you also at the same time? How much, how much and at this, people also tell themselves stories to give themselves more control over situations in retrospect. That's just the way the human mind works. So it's complicated, and I like it complicated and unresolved in that sense.
Yeah, before I throw the question over to Rudi again, I just want to say, yeah, that complication of responsibility, that really worked for me. It really came through, right? Because if we're just taking an ordinary, this story or a story like this could have very easily been a revenge story. Girls are a crime enacted against them, and they take the revenge, and we feel good about it because bad things happen to bad actors, to the Jareds, and that's like a first level of morality and responsibility. And as much as satisfaction is not quite the right word, as much as there's a certain closure in seeing revenge enacted upon bad actors, or seeing bad things happen to bad actors. When there's a complication involved, the seeing of choice and responsibility and measures, it just adds a complication that is both enjoyable on the story level and is food for thought. Rudi, does it push it more or less towards one kind of story to you? Whether, I said scarier, but scarier was maybe not quite the right word. Is it more of one kind of a story or another? If this is a story about being controlled, or if it's a story about, as Robert was telling us, seduction and choices in response.
Yeah, I mean, I think it works, and it works differently either way. But I think the third way, kind of, that Robert was talking about, if you've got that knot that isn't necessarily untied, that you have to wonder and work at it and consider that question, where the story isn't giving one way or the other, because then I think it kind of separates there's this stuff that happened and the narrator participated in, and we're hearing about it later and getting her viewpoint on that. But for me, part of that ambiguity points out that the degree of interpretation that she's bringing to it now, separating her from what actually was the case. And I mean, I'm not sure we can know, because I'm not sure she can totally pin that down either, which for me adds a somewhat extra disquieting element that even some very serious, drastic things can be ambiguous, looking back and seeing what went into them and how they happened.
I like that point, like where
kind of annoying.
The multiple explanations are organic to the story. With that point you made there, it's like we're not sure if she can know, and I love that. I think that's great. Just one or two more questions on ceremonials, and then we're going to move on to Rudi's story. But I want to talk about tropes. These stories that we're hearing tonight, ceremonials, and Rudi's story, which we're going to get to. Look, they're being presented in the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, which, despite its title, it's a genre magazine. It runs interstitial stories, depending where in its long history. It runs fantasy stories. It runs science fiction stories. It runs horror stories. And genre and boxes and labels, in many ways, don't matter. But hey, we're writers, we're readers. It maybe just matters in the way that it's fun. It's fun to talk about. A great story is a great story, no matter what we're going to call it. But I just think it's fun to, because these stories struck me, both of the stories. If they're not horror, they're very much having horror elements to them. Structurally, Robert, like the place where you ended the story, at least to this reader, it gave a new twist. Like we haven't exactly spoiled it or landed on it, but it did give us a new lens, a new twist, a new point of looking at interpreting the events of the story, and that came structurally at the end. And to me, I think there's a certain era of horror that I don't think was as morally or psychologically complex as your story, but there were sometimes horror stories like they end on that note, like dum dum, and I had that sort of an aspect there of like, and the story's ending with with an extra layer there. Talk about structure, how that plays into the structure of choosing that sort of an ending, and how that may or may not affect how us writers and readers might categorize it.
Yeah, I guess the story does kind of end on a dun-dun. I
You
don't
like my intellectual lingo I'm throwing left and right here?
I probably do that quite a bit thinking about it. But you know, I know you guys went to Clarion together. I assume that's the workshop that you were
Yeah.
addressed before.
20 odd years ago this summer.
I went to Clarion as well, and I was a Clarion 2006 graduate, I think.
Oh, okay.
So, we had Nancy Kress as one of our instructors.
Oh, wow.
And I mean, the tour de force teaching experience from that one was unbelievable. But one of the things that she said, the first thing she said to us when she showed up, she had read all of our stories that had been written before, in the weeks before she showed up, and she said, your stories are all fine, but the one thing all of you are guilty of is that you're not pushing your stories far enough. Keep pushing them further and further and further and further. And I've thought a lot about that over the years. And this was a story I definitely applied that to, which is like, what next, and then what, definitely the ending came about by applying that logic. It doesn't mean every short story has to be a novel, but it's just, it's how far can you take this? Which is true for any genre, but it's certainly true for horror, which is kind of an extreme genre anyway. And that doesn't mean like how gory can you make this? That's not my thing anyway. But how far can you push this? How far can you push what you're trying to say? That's probably a result of that. It is kind of like it's always fun, especially in horror, to leave someone unsettled at the end. Sometimes being unsettled is having an unresolved ending. What better way to unsettle someone than to do that?
Now that I know you're a student of Nancy Kress, at another time I have many more questions, more than time allows for tonight. But I have a lot of questions I would really want to hear about that experience. Nancy Kress, I was going to say for aspiring writers or just writers who like books on fiction. Nancy Kress, she's got many books, but the one book that that just connects to me, that I connect to, is called Beginnings, Middles, and Ends. I was just mentioning the book last night in conversation at KGB Bar with Greg Frost, who is a professor, and Matt Kressel was one of the hosts. And one of the things that Nancy Kress, at least in that book, does so well is it's a book on structure, and she codifies structures, things that you and I and all readers might feel, and she'll just say, okay, this is one sort of structure, and this is one, and this is another one. And I guess, yeah, if there's no right way to write a story, but yeah, if one wants to think about it, that book was a real eye opener, and one that I often come back to. I don't know if Nancy uses this term in the book, but when you hit on a point that I like to call the Kelly Link ending to a story. You defined it very adequately by saying, like, yeah, how unsettling is it to have a story that feels like it's not over and it goes on, and to end it there. And I just called it the Kelly Link ending because that was just something I learned from
Kelly. Kelly was another one of our instructors.
Oh, well, there's no surprise. There's no surprise. All very very, very, we're talking about the best authors and the best teachers there. So thank you so much for the insight into ceremonials. It was great. It was great talking about it.
Thank you so much.
I could talk forever about it. I really enjoyed reading. I really enjoyed the story, and I hope I have a feeling our listeners are going to be picking that up and enjoying it the way we did. So we've reached the middle point of our show, and going to mix things up a little bit. We're going to talk about Rudi's story, Starblind, Book Lost, and Hearing the Song of True Birds. And instead of having Rudi read from it and then talk about it, we're going to mix it up. We're going to have a chance to talk to Rudi about it by way of introduction and build up, because there's a lot of that, and then we'll end the show hearing from the story. So again, congratulations to the two of you. Congratulations for placing the story in the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. I'm probably calmer now about it than I've been, but I've been really excited for the two of you. We talked about Robert's first line. I want to start by talking to Rudi about your title, Starblind, Book Lost, and Hearing the Song of True Birds. So this is a standalone story in the magazine, but tell us about that title, about the naming convention in the title, and how it links to some other stories that you've written that share the setting of this story.
Yeah, well, so the title of this story, it's got three things going on, and they all refer maybe a little indirectly to kind of a moment, maybe 3/4 of the way through the story, where the main character thinks he's finished doing what he's going to be doing in the story, and is he's kind of maybe a little bit of a moment of rest, but also a moment where he's starting to realize what the effects are of what he's done. So definitely Starblind, there's a moment where he's trying to look at the stars. Book Lost, there's a book that's involved that is now where he's not going to be able to get at it. And then the True Birds and their songs comes in slightly after that. And it's just, well, I mean, I think the other thing you're edging towards with your question is this is the third in a series of stories that are set in this place, and they all had 3-part titles. The first one was Moonless, The Midnight Eye, and The Season of the Last Gate, so it had the moon. The second one was Sunfast, Shadow Play, and Saints Walk, so it had the sun. So when I wrote the second one, I started thinking, oh, this should be a set of 3, and I'll do slightly different variations on kind of a similar background in the story, in terms of they'd all be set in this one place. They'd all be set around festivals that are coming of age festivals, with 2 characters, one kind of inside in a way and one kind of outside and observing. And so when I sat down to write the third one, I knew I had to do star something. And it took a little while. There were a few attempts that totally didn't work. I forget what they were. It was, star something else.
Well, this attempt really works, and it's really working for me. I realize if it sounds like I'm a fan trying to bring you up to speed on some of my favorite works, and the answer to that is because I am. Let me tell our listeners that so these are a series of stories that have been written over a number of decades, and I'm fortunate enough to have been a student with Rudi for quite some time, and it's no secret that I've also been a real fan of his work for quite some time. So these are stories I'm going to try to. I know it's impossible to try to replicate that experience. Let's let's start with the first. Can you tell us the title of the first story, when it came out, and where it appeared? I know we can't replicate that experience, but maybe readers who like Starblind will be able to track it down. What was that first story?
Yeah, the first one isn't online, so you'd have to be tracking it down in print. It
Just
was
fun to do.
places. Yeah, that one was Moonless, The Midnight Eye, and The Season of the Last Gate. And that one happened because, and this is, early to mid 90s, my friend Paula Fleming, who's also a writer, back in those days before the internet, if you wanted to see what magazines were out there and what they were looking for, they were little like mimeographed zines. And she would pass on her old copies to me. And in one of them, there was an entry for a magazine called Shadow Dance, which said it wanted stories. I forget what all they asked for, but they were looking for poetic prose. And I was like, oh, I can come up with something that's like kind of poetic. So I did, and it was this fairly short story, like not much more than 1,000 words long, like 1,300 words. And it was kind of surreal, and I didn't think of doing anything more with it. But then I had the idea, like 10 years later, to do something again and to try to take a lot of the stuff that I'd made up that kind of sounded resonant, but and I knew what it meant to the character kind of in the moment, but I didn't have a big picture sense of the whole scene in the world. And I had the idea to go back and kind of fill it in more and and make it more of a substantial setting, and to just go back in and that's where I started kind of doing more with it in Sunfast, Shadow Play, and Saints Walk, which is.
So that's the name of, that's for our listeners. That's the name of the second story. And where does that one does appear online? Where did that initially appear, and where can it still be found, Rudi?
Yeah, you can find that still at Strange Horizons, strangehorizons.com, which is a great magazine to read anyway. Online magazine. Yeah. It's been going for quite a while. Does a lot of cool stuff. Yeah, and so that one, again, it's two kids and a younger sister and older sister. The older sister's going through this rite of passage.
Yeah, and it's set in a fantastical city and has a lot of. So look, Strange Horizons, and the other, some of the other venues of the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. Look, it's easy to put that story and be like, yeah, this is a fantasy story. I mean, at first glance, yeah, these are fantastical settings, or fantastical things happening. One of the things that struck me, and this has been already 20 years ago when I first read Saints Walk, was it's one of my favorite stories because it was one of those rare stories that, it stayed with me and has sort of disturbed me for many years after. But there's an interstitial nature to the story, which I found because Rudi mentioned it's a story of children, it's a story of rite of passage, which is sharing a synchronicity and an element with Robert's story that I didn't even realize at first. But I guess one of the things both of these stories that we're hearing from tonight are doing, and doing so well, but it really struck me in Saints Walk, is a sense of danger that happens to these innocents, these children. And in Saints Walk, I really did get a sense of these children were the innocence in terms of like, we're swimming in the deep end of the pool, we don't even know it, danger. And that was something that, despite the sense of wonder that comes from like, maybe would be the hallmark of a fantasy story, I didn't have the words for it yet. I didn't have the words for sense of horror, sense of wonder, or interstitial. But in reading Saints Walk, there was a sense of danger. And I associate sense of danger with being, that's what horror stories do for us. So do you consider yourself a writer of horror? Do you consider yourself a fantasist, or both, or neither?
Probably more a fantasist whose stuff may occasionally stray towards and maybe over into horror. I don't know if I call myself a horror writer to the extent that people who are looking for horror stories might not necessarily find what they're looking for in the things that I'm doing. But I know, horror readers are seem to be a fairly eclectic bunch. So I have a feeling that if it isn't necessarily labeled horror, they might still appreciate it.
They'll find, maybe they won't find what they're looking for, but they'll find something what they weren't looking for, which is quite possibly even better. It's hard. Again, it's hard to do it. Maybe it's even pointless to do it, to put a box in any one story, especially these 3 stories that I'm calling the City of Fisher stories. I talked about how I find them. Yeah, who knows? Are you a fantasist who has, fans of your work from some horror stories that just, no, I claim it. It's horror. It's horror.
Well, that's claimed to be new weird, but I'm not sure if that label's really around anymore. There was a point where writers like Jeff Vandermeer, when he was Ambergris stuff, and China Mieville with Perdido Street Station, where there's this kind of subcategory of, it was horror influenced, but it was definitely fantasy set in, an imagined secondary world, and often a city kind of maybe steampunk or early 20th century technology level. So I think the Fisher stuff kind of falls into that box pretty well.
Yeah.
It may not still be a box.
Yeah,
but
thanks for reminding me of the box. Yeah, I don't. I love doing it. I'm not. I also admit to not being up on all my names and labels and tropes. But yeah, it's like the weird and the new weird, and mentioning Jeff Vandermeer's work, and I love Perdido Street Station. Yeah. If you like those 2 authors, you're for sure gonna like Rudi's work. But yeah, tell us, if you can, tell us before we move on to Starblind, which is one more question about Saints Walk, which people can read on Strange Horizons to get ready for or enhance their reading of Starblind if you want to. Which we stress it is a standalone story, but what are some of those perils and dangers that the characters face in Saints Walk? And what is it for you about the horror or the horror elements or this new weird distinction that, in my opinion, works so well with other genres?
Well, I think part of what started to come along as I was going from one story to the other and things, and doing some other writing that hasn't appeared anywhere but is set in the same place. This sense that here's a city with this long history, and the people there have gotten involved over time with various supernatural beings that they've kind of struck alliances with, and that are kind of, what their religion is based around. But these aren't necessarily the most trustworthy and predictable kinds of beings. So kind of a feeling of danger just in that. But then also, I think when kids are growing up and you're hitting, the early teen years and things, it's a time when you're moving more out into the world, you're discovering more. There's a lot of things that are new and interesting, and it's a good time for curiosity. Your world's getting bigger probably than it has been in a lot of ways. So there's stuff that you're coming in contact with. So, this festival where you basically you go out and you wind up, anybody who's left above ground not hiding, which winds up being everybody between about 13 and 15 years old. If you're out, you wind up being possessed by these saints, by the deities of the city. And they just kind of do these random things and build weird stuff and do odd sort of surreal, get my surrealism back in that way. And so, I think that was interesting from a fantasy point of view. And then kind of the danger is that maybe the saint's not going to let go. Maybe you're not going to be able to come back to yourself, and return to the life that you had been living, the life you assumed you were growing into. And I think, I don't know all the reasons maybe that resonates, but I think one could be that, the more I kind of worked in Fisher, the more I realized there's all this spooky stuff going on, all these um, sort of supernatural things, but life is going on, and everybody's kind of accepting that, yeah, that happens, and that happens, and you kind of grew up, and it becomes just part of that festival you went through, and now all it is you have certain kind of cookies or cakes, and you go down to the catacombs, you hide out during the daylight hours and come back up, and and you help the younger members of your family get ready for it. And I think there's a kind of amnesia that happens in any society, and a certain amount of ways that the society at large tries not to think too much about the ways it puts some of its members in danger. Um, and that can be a really uh, it can be a sort of mysterious, fantastical thing, or it can be just a really mundane and tragic thing. Like last week when the report came out from the of all the things that hadn't happened that should have happened before the Uvalde school massacre, in terms of just little stuff like they weren't locking the doors in the school because they weren't able to get keys made because somebody didn't take the action to do that, and just little ways that you know lives get built, and you keep kind of living in a place, and some of the stranger things become ordinary. But when you're young and you're first coming in contact with them,
you touched on two really profound senses of danger that struck me. Like the one you said it, you came right out and said it, and you said it so well, because you're talking about these. Oh, there's cakes and cookies, and it's children, and the beings possessing you are doing strange and perhaps interesting things, and then there's the danger of possession, that one of these beings might not let go, and suddenly the saint, and they're all named wonderfully, like the saints. I don't want to guess. Do you have like the names of one of them, like the saints of keys and doorways, or the saints of cakes and cookies?
There's a saint of clocks and mirrors. There's a saint of, I forget if it was gloves and lost things.
Yeah, these fantastical yet mundane
files full of names of
things that suddenly that doesn't become cute anymore. Suddenly that becomes a violation. It becomes horror, in that now we're also talking about consent and perhaps measured. It becomes a violation, and a violation of not only a violation of your sense of self, but a complete and utter loss of a sense of self, which is suddenly the same exact thing is not funny anymore. And more so in the story in Starblind, you started talking about cultural amnesia, and how scary that is in today's world, and how scary that could be in the city of Fisher. Which, no spoilers. I thought it was really a great point that you said. There's an amnesia of sorts, and it just put a whole different level of danger going on there. So, moving on to Starblind, our main character is who we meet when the story opens is named Vitellius Cotton, and we meet his brother Aurelius, and they're the two main characters. And so when the story begins out, we've given you a bit of a history of the world and history of what may or may not go on in Fisher. Vitellius is visiting Aurelius in a ward, and he lives with others who are quote unquote disabled because Aurelius is not okay. He's someone who's been through, possibly or probably not successfully, one of these rituals or festivals or prophecies. So, by means of introducing the story, can you tell us about who is Vitellius, who he is, what he does, and where is he, and what does he want when we first meet him when the story opens, which you're going to read for us in just a little bit?
Okay. So Vitellius is he's a librarian, an archivist. He's a historian. in the city of Fisher, which has this long, kind of tangled and occasionally really obscure, for various reasons, history. So there's a lot for him to dig into and be kind of fascinated by. And later in the story, the more I read, it'll touch a little bit on why he's wound up being so interested in this, and why he's kind of built so much of his life around exploring, the dusty old archives and learning about the city's past. And it has to do with, kind of that he lost his brother. So, with each of the stories, it's gotten a little more drastic. And in Sunfast, there was the danger that you might not come back from the festival. And in Starblind, that danger has come to pass. And Vitellius's brother has been changed, and he's now a prophet. So we see pretty early on what that means. So at the beginning, Vitellius is coming around on one of his regular visits, and is kind of reminded of the state his brother is in.
Just like any brother who, when you're in that situation, you would just want your brother. A simple a conflict can simply be to just want your loved one to be okay, and they're not. I want to open the next couple of questions up to Robert as well. But before we talk about a really fun aspect of this, which I'm just going to call fictional books, I'll just backtrack and just ask Robert's take on what was your impression? Maybe perhaps if you could talk to either some of your impressions of your first time visitor to the city of Fisher, and maybe talk to your first visit there, or to the interstitial nature of the story. How did you find those things, Robert?
Well, I love this story, as I told Rudi when we had our little sound check. There were so many things about it that I adored. Definitely the I am a huge sucker, as are so many of us, for fake books. You have some great ones in there. It's a great it's certainly a great fantasy tradition, but it definitely, horror does it too. And were really, that was wonderful. I loved how from the get-go, I loved how the story hinges on these two brothers, one who, is a historian who looks to the past, and the other is, a seer who glimpses the future. And that was just such a cool, neat dynamic to use as a jumping off point. I'm really curious to know how. I want to know when you drafted this, because a lot of the, I think our relationship to masks has changed a lot in the past 2+ years. So I'm very curious to hear whether that was, when the story was finished, and whether that was an influence on it.
Yeah, well, it was finished like last year. Spring, summer, something like that. But it was started pre-pandemic, and a lot of the mask stuff was in there before. And so, as I was doing various revisions, I kept going, "Oh, masks! Everyone's going to cringe because they're masks, and they have all these extra associations." And for a while, I was like, "All right, is somebody going to think this is an anti-mask story because the masks are kind of
No, not at all."
So good to know.
Let's like Robert mentioned it, right? Like I think so many of us love the fake books, the fictional books, the wondrous books, which, right, like there's such a tradition of them in fantasy and horror, in weird fiction. There's one book it's critical to this story. It's called A Brief History of Fisher. So we'll throw it out to both Rudi and Robert can follow up on it. Yeah, just what are some of your favorite or standout fake books, fictional books that appear in other books? We'll throw it to Rudi first.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, I've got to say, making up fake books is huge fun when you're writing a story. Find a place to give you an excuse to do that. And yeah, in terms of favorite fake books, in the sound check, Dan, you were saying that you've just started reading the Argentine author Jorge Luis Borges, and he is huge on fake books. He loves fake books, fake references to articles, mixed in with real references to articles. That is totally his wheelhouse, and something he may in part have been picking up or riffing on from like Lovecraft, because he seems to have, read Lovecraft and stuff. Yeah, so he just goes to town. And one thing that I discovered somewhere in the pandemic times was I found this interesting book on Borges called Hidden Pleasures in Borges Fiction by Evelyn Fishburne. It's like available as a PDF online. But she has one article in there where she tracks down Borges used to talk about this one night in the Arabian Nights that like, because the copyist slipped up, if you read certain editions of the Arabian Nights, you'd get to the middle or to the end, and like the story that Scheherazade would be telling would be the story of the Arabian Nights. It was like this infinite loop thing going on. And this is like a perfect Borges moment. So everyone has always assumed that he totally made that up. But this Evelyn Fishburne, this scholar, had like, in this article, has like tracked down like which editions he'd seen and actually managed to find an edition that has it in like the appendix and maybe in a footnote or something. But it actually does have a version where the story is restarting. And I read that, and it's like a fun article. And then I was like, well, but is this real, or has she like totally fallen under Borges' spell?
I was thinking like immediately I was thinking, is that a real thing, a real phenomenon? And that was the first thing I was thinking when I heard that. Speaking, I will have like one or two more questions, then we're going to jump into hearing you read from the story. Speaking of, is it real? Is it real in this reality? Yeah, another trope that's kind of fun that also crosses genres is both other realities, other dimensions, their interplay or crossing over from ours to theirs, and the people who love them, and the wizard-like, I'm going to say like the wizard-like figures who do this research and experiment, and depending on what genre we're in, with these other dimensions and other realities. Yeah, we see it in one way in fantasy, we see it another way in weird fiction. I might be saying his name wrong. The character is Osier, or the Osier, and you could tell us how he sets Vitellius's journey into play. And yeah, both Robert and Rudi can talk about favorite wizards in fake books, as in all books that aren't true are fake.
I guess I should start. Osier's a character who's been in all three stories. He's this mysterious kind of ancient person who's just always been around. Another one of those things that nobody really pays attention to. He emerged early as somebody who's just involved in keeping the festival running, whatever the festival was in the story. And more I kind of worked with the character, sort of started to figure out that for various like super backstory reasons, he's very motivated to keep the city continuing, to do whatever he sees needs to be done to keep the city from changing too much and possibly, in ways that might threaten it. So he's really mindful of the continuance of the whole of the city, but not so mindful of the impact on individual people within the city who might get caught up in that.
So before I ask Robert some of his favorite wizard figures and books, you mentioned Ozier's trying to keep it from changing too much, which the risk, just like the risk of losing yourself to one of these festivals, when you start messing with reality is, and what the story does so well is, yeah, just showing how much of a mess can be made when you try to tamper with that. Some favorite wizards, Robert?
Pass.
I was going to say it doesn't have to be.
I can do fake books. I don't have a favorite wizard. I feel like must be something wrong with me. I don't have a favorite wizard.
Not at all. I was trying to steer to the direction none of these Gandalfs and Dungeons and Dragons, which have their joy but there are also the weird fiction has a tradition of these there's almost a trope of the solitary, the perhaps the Clark Ashton Smith or the Lovecraftian person who is tampering, I was just sort of pushing it that way. But please, a cousin of that sort of character is, they love their fake books. What are some that come to your mind?
I was going to mention, because Rudi mentioned Borges, that Roberto Bolaño, who comes out of that South American tradition, is like a total master of the fake book. I mean, he's not considered like a fantasist necessarily, but he has a ton of them. But and another one that's also not from speculative fiction per se is Diane Setterfeld's The 13th Tale. I don't know if either of you have ever read that. That is that's the name of the book. I can't remember what the fake book is, but it hinges on the 13th tale of this collection of short stories that isn't in the book. Like they promise a 13th tale in the book, but there isn't one. So that's part of the whole mystery.
Oh, very cool. Well, the last question I'll give to Rudi before we move on to the reading is moving from fake books to imaginary places. One of the projects that Rudi is doing right now is a project called Tales of Imaginary Places, where Rudi is generating very setting-inspired series of podcast fiction and flash fiction. So Rudi, if you could tell us about the Tales from Imaginary Places project and how it came to be.
For a while I'd been thinking there were some interesting things I could maybe do with sending out an email newsletter that was a serial of some kind, and maybe doing a podcast in parallel, kind of reading the bits too. But I could never find, I kept thinking up stories and they get like too long and too complicated. And I realized it was hard to break them into good chunks to like portion out every week or every month or something. So I came around to doing this set of stories that are they're not really related, but they're each set in a different imaginary place, each time with a character, and I kind of made up a little scheme that I'm using in order to sort of generate and put myself in interesting situations to come up with the places and come up with the characters and what they do and what they're trying to do. So not to give too much away, but each place is secretly inspired by a different animal. So like Archive was zebra because it's like an opposite running alphabet. So, and yes, giving away here, Bungalow was inspired by yaks. I mean, they're not deeply inspired. Nobody else would probably figure this out from looking at them. But Catacombs, that I'll hopefully get out this week, is X-ray fish. And then, each character has a certain profession. So I'm kind of dropping these characters in semi-randomly. I made up a list, and now I'm like saying, okay, so why is a jockey in the Archive? Why is an ecologist was it ecologist? Anyway, yeah.
Now I'm going to have to hunt for all the Easter eggs. I already love these stories, and now that there's another level to them, I'm just going to have to find the secret animal connection.
Yes, yeah.
To all of them.
And the weird thing was, animals started cropping up in the stories, but never the animal that it was like supposed to be inspiring the place. Just
how perfect.
But yeah, it's been good because it's kind of made me. On the one hand, it's got kind of a repeating pattern, but it also puts me in situations where I have to kind of think up different shapes for the stories, just because what would make sense for this person to be in this place, and what would happen next.
Sometimes those repeating patterns, what do they call it? The tyranny of structure. If you've committed to a structure, what's something I experienced in your project participating in the Daily Cabal, which was a flash fiction project. Sometimes that tyranny of structure is liberating, to the reasons you exactly said, in that it's do or die. We're going to come up with something interesting because we must. That said, let's go to this imaginary place by Rudi Dornemann, The City of Fisher. We'll give it to Rudi to take away. He'll be take it away by reading from Starblind, Book Lost, and Hearing the Song of True Birds. And here's Rudi.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for the intro, and thanks for tuning in, everybody. And thanks for the great reading, Robert. Here's Starblind, Book Lost, and Hearing the Songs of True Birds. That particular Tuesday, Vitellius Cotton visited the prophets on his lunch break and read to them. The prophecy was 4 rows of cages on a grassy, tree-shaded area behind every saint's cathedral. Gold filigree cages, each larger than Vitellius's own bedroom, but cages nonetheless. In every one, a prophet babbled. Men, women, young, old, chanting, whispering, yelling, muttering, declaiming to invisible crowds, speaking in hums. All wore identical baggy blue canvas smocks, and none seemed to mind the breeze blowing through the walls. Vitellius walked right to the cell where his brother had lived for the past 3 decades, ever since the blessing, the curse of prophecy had caught him. The cell where Orlin now lay on the dirt beneath his cot. His cracked lips were whispering, his fingers fluttering in time to words Vitellius could barely hear. Then a hitching pause, a shallow breath, then whispering on. His neighbors on either side were in shouting moods. To the left, something about cabbages and winter floods. To the right, something about riots and the market at the Great Round. Smoke twisting upward like a braided rope. Green peace. Something about snail shells. Vitellius doubted his brother's words would be much different from the rest of the cacophony. Any trace of his own personality had been swept away by the endless rush of prophecy. Still, Vitellius pressed his ear against the cage wire. We find what we need by falling, said Orlin. He's got all the birds. An acolyte walked by, one of the usual guards. Yeah, he said, Ori's been quiet the last day or so. The mask answers, said Orlin. Every step an hour, every rope a knot. The acolyte carried a logbook attached to the belt of his cassock by a silver chain, a holdover from the days when the cathedral archives were full of prophetic ramblings. These days, nothing but a badge of office. Vitellius had never seen an acolyte write in one. All the best birds, he has them. Ask the mask, ask the mask. Like all of the green touch, Orlin riddled on. The mask can be quiet, not loud as our future voices, or those machines in the harbor. If Vitellius listened long enough, he always started thinking it meant something. Listen, listen, said Orlin. He doesn't want to hear. Not masks, not pasts, all the best. If he kept listening, however, it always disintegrated back into nonsense. There's more than one and less than none, so angel bane for everyone. Vitellius sat on the splintery bench opposite Orland's cage and ate his lunch, mushroom paste on dark bread, along with a paper cup of fried parsnip shavings he'd bought on the walk over. He let the waves of language wash past him as he chewed. The archivist in Vitellius wanted to write everything down as fast as his brother spoke. The historian in him knew it was hopeless. For all the portentous non sequiturs, all the metaphors that had the sound of veiled allusions, there were never enough clues to let him work his way back to anything like concrete meaning. He usually left when the acolytes came to try to spoon in broth between Orland's words. Mealtime always meant sputtering, often meant choking and gasping. Food was the leading cause of death among the green-touched. That day, however, when the acolytes came sloshing down the aisle with buckets of greasy soup and stacks of splintering wood bowls, he found himself reluctant to get up. The man in the mud-spattered smock barely felt like his brother anymore, but now that their parents were departed, Orland was the person he'd known longest, probably the person he saw most often after his co-workers at the city library. So Vitellius sat, watched, listened for the syllables that made it past the soup. Not 3 spoonfuls in, Orland choked while saying something about sacred chains. He hacked, rasped out a couple indistinguishable words, went red in the face, and turned his head slightly, which the acolyte must have mistaken for swallowing because he had the spoon between Orland's teeth again as soon as he opened his mouth. He kept most of that spoonful down. Vitellius found a book he had in his hand, a copy of his own latest, A Brief History of Fisher, which he was gradually marking up with a red pencil, finding corrections for the next edition. It was something to read, though, an escape from the tension of feeding time, and he opened it to a random page. One of the most colorful of that colorful clique was Rainier Olpham, he read, who was frequently seen roving the streets of the cartographer's quarter in a leopard print long coat and sporting a monkey-headed cane. He had a fine singing voice and was known to extemporize poetry as he walked on the riverbank in the pre-dawn hours. A self-proclaimed alchemistical historian, he is best remembered for his 16-volume series, Treatises on the Incorporeal Realms. Vitellius realized he was reading aloud. One of the acolytes looked at him as if he were the one wearing a leopard print coat. Vitellius swallowed a cough and continued. And, though they grow increasingly more delirious and less intelligible in the later volumes, the treatises offer a host of insights into a highly period in our city's history. New songs, no, said Orland, his teeth clacking on the broth spoon. They're old songs, he said, and coughed wetly on the acolyte who fed him. A single footnote in Olpham's 4th treatise, Vitellius read, subtitled On the Spectral Agriculture, is rich with implied details. Old songs returning, said Orland, and the acolyte blotted his chin with a rag. In 30 years, this was the closest the brothers had come to a conversation. Including details on the state of cross-border trade, migration, and cultural diffusion between the city, the islands, the southern coastal settlements, and the island provinces, even as far as the Gurge Mountain city-states. Orland's words had stopped, and Vitellius looked up, half expecting to see him listening. But he was choking again, his body racked with soundless coughs, while the acolyte still tried to circle the spoon around to his lips. Vitellius saw his brother's throat pulse, his jaw clench. Come on, said the acolyte, mouthfuls. Vitellius dropped his book to his lap, and his brother looked up at him, the trance gaze gone from his eyes for a moment, a trapped, panicked moment, a look Vitellius knew from when they were children. Any time his brother had looked to him for help, and most particularly that moment at the end of the green chase, when they both knew Orland wouldn't make it to the safety of the cathedral steps before the mob of prophets caught him and passed on their condition with a touch. Then, with a great shaking wheeze, Orland knocked the spoon away and breathed in. Vitellius sat a moment, hands folded over his book, his brother silent in one of those moments when all the prophets seemed to pause at once. He could hear the soup cart dripping. "Listen," said Orland in a clear, strong voice. "Listen. He doesn't want to hear. Not masks, not pasts. He'll make them sing." Vitellius stood. He walked away. The other prophets were saying things, shouting things, laughing, weeping, but Orland's voice followed him down the corridor. "Sing, sing, sing, all ninely, and buildings melt like sunny day ice." Up on the cathedral spire, the prism chimed the hour of sand, the end of Vitellius's lunch break. "He has the best birds," said Orland. "All the best birds." "Will you do it then?" Osier had asked after he had explained everything. No, Vitellius had replied. He would not resurrect the old forbidden festival. That had been 6 weeks ago. He'd continued to meet with the old man every Wednesday after work in the maze of little alleys behind the law courts where the old statues were kept. No, he'd said 5 weeks ago, as he sketched the sculptures that he suspected had once been a memorial to the washerwoman's uprising. Not even if it did release Orland from the professary. Not even if it eliminated the professary altogether. Too many other things might be changed, and there was no way of knowing how they'd change. If anything changed at all. 4 weeks ago, as he jotted down the details from some of the plinths that still held their descriptive plaques. No, 3 weeks back, after Osier had been telling him how there had once been lines of fish weirs across the mouth of the river, which had been hauled in after every turning of the tide. Between Wednesdays, whenever Vitellius ran into the old man around the city, which seemed to happen a bit more often than usual, Osier had continued to angle towards the subject, asking if Vitellius ever grew tired of being an observer, never a participant, or better, the prime actor in events, if he ever imagined himself in the place of Hespen Ferenthal on the city walls before the long noon, or as Bergan addressing the tribunal before the sentencing of the last king. Vitellius had shrugged. He saw those things vividly enough through the archive records and the accounts of historians before him. History was present for him in all the traces that were all around him all the time. So he'd said no 2 weeks ago, after he'd recounted to Osier some of the discoveries and files from the now discontinued office of the deputy submayor, and Osier had seemed to know most of them already. And no, 1 week ago, on a drizzly evening, drying out and warming up in a cheap restaurant after an hour of trying to determine which statues were the creations of which workshops and foundries. No, he would not gamble the city's future and its past in an attempt to save his brother. But now, as he walked away from the rows of golden cages, Vitellius didn't hear whatever comment the guards made as he left, didn't see the midday downtown crowds as he walked through them like a man being chased in a dream. Orland's line about singing all ninely kept coming back to him. He wished he'd listened more carefully or even taken notes. What was all that about birds? And there was something about glaciers? It was nonsense. It was coincidence. Orland had no way of knowing that it was the Festival of Nines that Osier wanted to bring back. And if he had known, what were the chances that Orland could have expressed himself in any way that Vitellius would understand? He found that rather than walking to the nearest tram stop, he'd walked up the line and was now at the edge of the common, which was full of families out enjoying what might be the last warm day of the season. hawkers and entertainers loudly advertising what those families would surely want to buy or watch or hear. He had to nearly bend double to catch his own rattling breath, as if he'd been running, as if he'd been choking. "Do you know what day it is, Vitellius?" He straightened up to find Osier facing him. He seemed to have been waiting. "Technically," said the old man, "the day is nothing special, but this evening begins the Festival of Nines. Let's find somewhere quieter to talk." Vitellius's vision blurred for a moment. He pinched the bridge of his nose and everything was clear again. "There are reasons why the festival's been banned for nearly 200 years, he said, and why any mention of it has been purged from official records. There were only 2 surviving first-hand accounts of the celebration. He'd read them both, but barely understood why it had been outlawed. "Let's go down to the lunarium," said Osier. Did Osier know how much Orlin and Vitellius had loved the lunarium when they were kids? How often they'd gone there? And how thoroughly Vitellius had avoided it since the green chase? The old man escorted him in silence across the common, his hand locked on Vitellius's arm, and didn't say a word the whole 14 flights down the dark, crowded stairs. Vitellius's arm ached by the time they reached the bottom. As old as Osier was, and Vitellius had never been able to work out exactly how old, he was strong. Then they came out into all the colored electric lights, all the mechanical motion, in time to see a calliope boat pull out from the docks, departing for the far shore without them. The just disembarked crowd surged past as the 2 of them stepped into the lunarium's always evening. They stood on the empty docks, looking out across the lake. On the other shore, a busy evening in the lunarium proper, with visitors strolling among samovar-bodied, teacup-handled spiders, or riding self-pedaling hobby horse rickshaws. Crowds swelled around trees full of silver-tinkling, music box-skulled monkeys. Meanwhile, around Vitellius and Osier, Departure Island was empty. "You've written about this yourself," said Osier, "how repeating events always at the same time each year, with the same activities, same songs, same foods, all help stabilize the city, to keep society aligned with its most essential essence through repetition of its most frivolous appearing customs. I think that was your phrase." The old man was always helping out around town, and Vitellius had noticed was always particularly active on Fisher's many festivals, parades, and historical holidays. "Like a top steadying itself through spinning," said Osier. "If a new force is introduced or an old one returned, it could tilt that spinning to a new equator." Vitellius wasn't sure of the geometry or physics of the old man's metaphor, but he got the idea. "A city with the Festival of Nines restored might be a city with the rite of the green chase removed," he said. The 2 festivals were at opposite ends of the calendar. "And not just the current year," said Osier. "There would be a wider rebalancing." "A world without prophets," said Vitellius. "Are you sure?" "Very likely, yes," said Osier. Besides being unknowably ancient, he never seemed to blink enough. Vitellius watched across the water, waiting for the automatons to do something he hadn't seen before. It was less fun without someone else watching for the same thing, someone to talk it over with later, without Orlin. "Tomorrow this might all be gone too," he said. "Might indeed," said Osier. "I know changes will come, but with so many years of choices and chances that might be unchosen and unchanced, I can't say exactly which or where or how or what. No one can. The whole lunarium might be nothing but stalactites and drip water in the morning." "But the change I've promised you," said Osier, "I'm quite certain that will happen." Somehow, although he hadn't said as much out loud, Vitellius had agreed to Osier's plan. Vitellius wished they'd caught the Calliope ferry, that they were wandering on the far shore, enjoying one last tour through the mechanical works of the ancient architect-inventor Plinn. Maybe buying apple lace pancakes and rose hip syrup from a wind-up vendor whose skirt was her griddle. 8 lunarium tokens, he remembered, but worth it. His hand brushed against the half-eaten sandwich in his pocket, and beside it the book, his brief history of Fisher. It might all be nonsense this time tomorrow, some or all of its contents never having happened. The book itself might never have been written. Maybe none of his books would have been. And that's where I'll leave you to continue if you happen to pick up the magazine.
Thank you so much, Rudy. Great. Oh, let me unmute Robert as well. I guess I can't there, but
I did.
Thank you, Rudy. So I want to say as we're getting very near the end of our show tonight. Thank you so much to Rudi Dornemann, who just read from his story from the magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, and thank you also to Robert Levy, whose story appears in that same issue. It's the July-August of 2022. Oh, did you hold it up again?
I did.
Magazine of Fantasy.
Got to paddle the magazine, right?
So yeah, I'm looking. It's again. I think it's they're on their way to a bookstore. They're on their way to a bookstore near you. So you've been watching. I'm going to ask Robert and Rudy to please stay online when we end our broadcast. Again, happy birthday to Rudy's wife Audrey, who is. I see she's there in the comments. Happy birthday, Audrey. Thank you to our listeners for joining us for the readings and the discussion tonight. Before we go, I'll make one brief plug, one brief shout out, another reading series, the Gold Standard reading series I'd like to mention tonight is called Fantastic Fiction at KGB Bar, New York City. And that's hosted by Ellen Datlow and Matthew Kressel. If you're in New York, well, then you've either been there or to make it your business to get there one of these days. If you're not in New York, it's something they also have a website where you can listen to them after the fact of the audio of that. It's a long-running genre reading series. It means a lot to a lot of people. Right now, they need your help. They could use your support in both KGB Bar and Fantastic Fiction in remaining in their home in KGB Bar. So, yeah, search them. I don't have the direct link right now, but just figured it'd be worth a mention to search it up, check it out, see if it's something that interests you or something you'd like to support. Again, you've been listening to Nighttime Logic with Rudi Dornemann and Robert Levy. Thank you so much, you two. Everyone stay cool, stay safe out there, and we will see you again in August for our next event. Have a great night, everyone.